Have you ever wondered if human language wasn't just a tool, but a trap? What if the very words we speak were designed not by evolution, but by something far older, far more intelligent, and far more patient? In The Last Tongue, we uncover a terrifying truth: humanity was written, not born. A frequency buried in our blood. A glyph hidden in our bones. And now, it's waking up. Monuments around the world begin to hum. Dreams turn into shared memories. And one man, Elias Rhain, finds himself caught in a signal that predates history itself. What happens when the language you speak speaks back? Stay with me, because this story doesn't just explain the origin of our species, it asks, what were we made for, and who is finally returning to claim us? Elias Rhain had always known there were codes buried beneath the surface of what we call language, ancient rhythms pulsing like forgotten heartbeats through dead alphabets, lost phonemes, and symbols that predated speech itself. He wasn't just a linguist. He was a seeker of the unspeakable, someone who believed that if you listened long enough, silence itself would begin to whisper. It was on a rainy afternoon in Basel, the sky low and heavy, that Elias first noticed the pattern. He had been comparing early Sumerian tablet fragments with undeciphered Rongarongo symbols from Easter Island, casually, as he often did when insomnia took root in his bones. But this time, something clicked. There, hidden in the curvature of the carvings, was a spiral, subtle, incomplete, but eerily consistent. Days passed, and he found it again on a funerary stele in Malta, barely visible beneath centuries of erosion, then again etched into the underside of a jade disc from the Olmec civilization. Different cultures. Different epochs. Same spiral. Same silent scream through stone. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a word. It was a design, one that seemed not to communicate information, but to trigger memory. He called it the seed glyph, not because it planted meaning, but because it awakened something that had always been there. Elias became obsessed. He combed through every linguistic anomaly, every undeciphered code across centuries. The more he looked, the more he found it in linear A, in the Antikythera mechanism, in the tattoos on the mummified body of a Siberian shaman. It was like chasing a shadow that had walked beside humanity since its first breath. But the real change began when he tried to speak it. Not in words, for it had none, but in sound, vibration. He sat alone in the cold hush of his office, lights dimmed, rain tapping on the windows like soft knuckles from the other side of reality. He closed his eyes and traced the glyph in the air, slowly, letting his voice follow an instinct he couldn't explain. A low hum came from his throat, rising and falling in strange intervals, unfamiliar yet intimate, as though he had done it 1,000 times before. That's when the light surged and died. Total blackness. A moment stretched, suspended, then a shiver, not of fear, but recognition, passed through him like ice in the veins. The emergency lights flickered on. Elias was on the floor, sweat-soaked, heart pounding like a signal trying to escape his chest. His hand was bleeding. He had carved the glyph into his desk without knowing. That night, he dreamed. But it wasn't a dream. It was something more precise, more tactile. He stood on a plateau beneath a sky with 2 moons, 1,000 black towers reaching up like ribs toward the stars. There were no people, only echoes, deep, reverberating pulses of thought, like language without voice. At the center of the city, something massive slept beneath a dome of glass. As Elias moved toward it, he felt the same vibration he had spoken, only now, it spoke back. He awoke gasping, with the taste of metal in his mouth and his eyes wet from tears he didn't remember shedding. On the mirror above his sink, scrawled in steam, You are not dreaming. He ran simulations. Plotted the glyph's appearances globally. It formed a spiral rooted at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple on Earth. But it wasn't the origin. It was the reactivation point. A lattice. A code buried in humanity's collective mind, like software dormant until the right frequency unlocked it. Elias began to wonder, what if language was never about communication but about control? What if the first words weren't spoken to express, but to bind? And what if someone, or something, was waiting for us to remember what we are? Then the package arrived. No sender. No tracking. Inside, an obsidian shard, smooth and cold, with the glyph etched deep, so deep it seemed to shimmer even in shadow. Attached was a note, written in hurried strokes. You are not the first. But you may be the last. Stop speaking. They are listening. Elias didn't sleep that night. But he listened. And in the silence between thoughts, something ancient stirred. It was no longer a question of what the glyph meant. It was a matter of time before it answered back. Elias Rhain didn't fall asleep that night. He slipped into it, like falling through ice. One moment he was sitting upright, eyes burning behind glasses too thick with midnight reading. The next, his consciousness dropped, suddenly and silently, as if called somewhere without permission. There was no bed, no dreamscape, only that same plateau he had seen before, an impossible land beneath a sky that pulsed like a living thing. The twin moons stared down at him, unblinking, as if judging whether he had the right to be there. The wind moved sideways, in rhythmic intervals, as if it carried not air but thought. The towers were still there, black stone, spiraling upward, each humming faintly like tuning forks that had been struck in a language never meant for mouths. He walked. The ground beneath his feet wasn't made of stone or soil, it was a kind of shimmering mesh, semi-transparent, as if the world itself was a projection onto something older beneath. Beneath his steps, light moved symbols, letters, words from forgotten tongues lit up in pulses. He recognized fragments. A curl from the Sumerian alphabet. A cross stroke from Rongorongo. A spiral matching the seed glyph. It was as if the dream was reading him, scanning his memory, extracting the echoes of all human speech and showing him that none of it was original. All language, it whispered, had been seeded. He stopped at the center of a vast circular structure, an arena made not for people, but for minds. A glass dome hung suspended above the space, not by cables, but by pure vibration, held aloft by sound alone. Beneath it, something massive lay in stillness. He couldn't see it clearly, its shape refused the eye, as if each part shifted the moment it was looked at, folding in and out of dimensional rules. But he felt it. A presence. It wasn't watching him. It was inside him. Suddenly, the hum grew louder. The glyphs on the ground spun, forming a wheel. In the center, one word emerged, glowing bright white. Remember. A voice filled his mind, not heard with ears, but felt in bone. It wasn't in any language, yet he understood every syllable. It said, "You were built with memory, Elias. Not your own, but ours. You carry fragments. All of you do. But only a few can unlock them. You have spoken the pattern. Now the dream is open. But beware, those who dream too deep may never wake." He wanted to speak, but his throat locked. His body trembled violently. He collapsed to his knees, eyes wide, choking on air that wasn't air. And then he awoke. On the floor. In his office. Dawn light flickering pale through the dusty blinds. But something was wrong. His skin itched. His tongue felt burned. He stumbled to the mirror, and his reflection made him freeze. His pupils were still dilated. Pitch black. Unblinking. Like the sky in the dream. Worse yet, on the wall behind him, scratched deeply into the plaster, were the same glyphs from the dream, drawn in something that looked like blood. His hands were clean. The office door had been locked. There were no cameras. No signs of entry. But there, beneath the final glyph, was one word he had never written. Return. Elias had no intention of going to Iceland. But the coordinates written beneath the word return led him to a set of ruins deep beneath Langjökull Glacier. At first, he thought it was a mistake. There were no records of ancient temples beneath the ice, no signs of habitation. But something in his gut told him this wasn't a journey of discovery. It was a summons. He followed the trail of obsidian shards left like breadcrumbs by hands unseen. The glacial wind clawed at his skin as he descended into a cave, a narrow mouth at the base of a wall of ancient ice. Inside, silence reigned. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the kind that presses against your ears like water, a dense, humming silence that feels watched. His flashlight flickered. The batteries were new. He went deeper. The tunnel narrowed, winding downward in spirals that mirrored the glyphs burned into his memory. At the final bend, he found a chamber. Carved directly into basalt and ice, it looked impossibly old, pre-human. The walls were smooth, as if melted by an intense heat long forgotten. And in the center stood a stone structure shaped like a spiral shell, black as void, glistening with frost. It wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It was something else. Something alive with memory. Elias stepped forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he neared the object, a vibration filled the room. Low, steady, like a heartbeat buried under mountains. Then he saw it on the outer curve of the spiral, etched so finely it could only be seen when the light hit just right, the seed glyph. Dozens of them, layered in patterns, each one slightly different, like variations of a song only a dead god could remember. He reached out and touched the surface. The chamber shuddered. His mind was ripped from his body. He was standing at the center of a memory not his own. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It was a recording, no, a residue of something left behind by a consciousness ancient beyond imagination. He saw towering figures, not alien in shape, but in presence cloaked in shadow, their heads crowned with symbols instead of flesh. They moved without motion. Spoke without sound. They were building something. Not with tools. With frequency. Each structure they raised responded to tones spoken in the last tongue. He realized, horrified, that the glyphs were not language, they were commands. Triggers. Protocols. And the spiral structure beneath the glacier was not a monument, it was a speaker. Suddenly, the scene shifted. One of the figures turned toward him, not in the vision, but in the chamber. His breath caught. There was no face. Only a void. And from that void, a single sound emerged, not heard, but felt in every atom of his body. It was the sound of awakening. Elias screamed. He found himself on the ground, gasping, hands shaking. The spiral structure had begun to hum, softly, rhythmically. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat. His skin felt electrified. His thoughts no longer felt fully his. And then, from the spiral, came a whisper. Not in words. In presence. We left this place in silence. You have broken it. Elias didn't return to the university. He couldn't. After what he'd seen beneath the glacier, reality no longer felt stable. It bent at the edges. Sounds lingered too long in the air. Reflections shifted when they thought no one watched. His mind, once sharp, skeptical, methodical, now pulsed with static. It was like a receiver left on overnight, absorbing something from a signal too deep, too old to be recognized by modern cognition. But it was there. Always humming. Always waiting. For days he remained isolated in a cabin hidden deep in the Swiss woods. No internet. No power grid. Only candles, notebooks, and the spiral glyph carved into every wall like a warding spell. He couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he heard himself speaking, but not in his own voice. In that low, layered tone, one voice inside another, and another beneath that. It wasn't him. It wasn't human. One night, just before dawn, Elias awoke to find he had moved. He stood barefoot on the floor, back arched, mouth open, whispering. The words spilled without will. The language was unfamiliar, not learned but extracted. The air in the room turned heavy, almost metallic. Books vibrated on the shelves. Ink in his pens began to rise, forming small shapes in the air like black liquid glyphs. Elias tried to stop, but his mouth continued. He bit down. Blood. Pain. Silence. But it was too late. The spiral carved into the wall began to glow faintly, pulsing like a living eye. His body trembled. He dropped to the floor. Something inside him was trying to write itself through him. Not through thought, not through feeling, but through language. And with each syllable, he felt his own memories slipping. The names of loved ones. Childhood places. Gone. In their place, images of alien landscapes, cities woven from crystal and sound, and instructions not remembered, but remembered anyway. He locked himself in the cellar, desperate to remain Elias. He wrote everything he could still recall in dozens of notebooks, terrified he might wake tomorrow and not know what he was. For 3 days, he spoke no word. Not even to himself. Even a whisper might give it room to grow. But silence wasn't safe either. On the 4th day, something began tapping from inside the cellar wall. 3 slow taps. Then silence. Then again. Not mechanical. Not animal. Measured. Rhythmic. Language in knock form. He pressed his ear to the stone and heard it not sound, but meaning. Speak, Elias. You carry the tongue. It is time to open the archive. In a moment of fear-shattered instinct, he screamed in the voice of the glyph. The wall cracked. Dust fell. And from the break, a gust of wind poured out, cold, ancient, and saturated with the smell of ash and lightning. On the other side, a staircase spiraled downward into perfect darkness. Not built by hands. Revealed by memory. And in the center of that void, something stirred. It didn't come toward him. It was already in him, growing louder, more insistent. Every language he had ever studied bent toward the center. As if they were just broken branches of a single, long-lost root. He understood now language was never human. It was the tool left behind to one day call them back. And Elias had already made the first call. The spiral staircase led downward into something that wasn't a tunnel but a memory, carved into stone. The air was dense, not with dust, but with time itself. Every breath Elias took felt like inhaling centuries. His steps echoed strangely, not repeating once, but twice, first in his ears, then deeper, as if reality itself was echoing back a second version of him. He felt watched. Not by eyes, but by presence. As if the walls themselves still remembered the ones who built them, and had yet to decide whether Elias was kin or intruder. The deeper he went, the warmer it became, not in temperature, but in sensation. A vibration in his chest, low and constant, like a chant heard through bone. At the base of the spiral, he entered a vast hall unlike anything he'd seen. No lights. Yet everything shimmered with a soft, blue glow as if illuminated by the memory of stars. The architecture was not human. There were no straight lines, no corners. Everything curved. The walls moved with the fluidity of organic thought, stone folded into stone, like language turning in on itself. Symbols were etched everywhere, each one humming faintly as he passed. Not sounds. Not light. Meaning, suspended like mist in the air. In the center of the chamber stood what could only be described as a monument, yet it looked more like a brain. A colossal, obsidian structure, shaped like two hemispheres wrapped around a crystal core that pulsed like a living heart. Surrounding it were humanoid statues, tall, faceless, draped in robes made from stone so fine it seemed to flow. Each held a scroll, but not written in ink, etched with light, shifting between alphabets Elias didn't recognize, as if waiting to settle on a language he could understand. Then the room changed. Not physically, but perceptually. The walls breathed. And the statues turned. Not moved, turned, as if reality skipped forward one frame, and now they simply stood in a different position. Their faces were still blank, but something behind them stared at him. The vibration intensified. The scrolls in their hands began to glow brighter, and from within the brain-like monument, a sound emerged. Not a word. Not even a tone. A pattern. Rhythmic. Familiar. It was the same cadence Elias had spoken in the cabin. The language that wasn't language. The tongue. He dropped to his knees. It wasn't pain. It was invasion. A wave of thought hit him, images, voices, histories, but not human. Not even linear. He saw stars born from silence. He saw towers rising on planets without names. He saw the first builders, creatures not made of flesh, but of intention, of language crystallized into form. They built not with hands, but with commands. With the tongue. With the word that shapes. And earth. Earth was never their home. It was a seed vault. A library. A place to bury knowledge in the safest vessel, biological memory. He saw humanity born not in Eden, but in a lab, wrapped in language like a cocoon, programmed to forget until time circled back. The builders left because they had to. Something was coming. Something they could not face. So they hid their knowledge not in machines, not in code, but in us. And now, Elias had awakened part of it. Suddenly, one of the scrolls floated toward him. The glyphs on it twisted, forming words he understood. You are the carrier. You must choose, remember, or remain. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. The moment he touched the scroll, a burn raced up his arm, searing through his nerves. And in that instant, he remembered everything. Not as Elias, but as a builder. The last one. Left behind. In human form. Dormant. His scream was not human. It echoed in the chamber, in the language that shaped planets. And the monument awakened. Elias wasn't the same when he left the archive beneath the glacier. He didn't walk out. He was let go. The moment he crossed the threshold, he could feel it. The world no longer moved the way it used to. Light bent around corners before it reached his eyes. Sounds echoed without direction. Time felt smeared, like the seconds refused to line up correctly. Something inside him had changed. Something deep. Something cellular. He returned to the cabin, hands trembling, skin still buzzing from contact with the scroll. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again, the frequency. Not a word. Not a sentence. But a pure tone, buried under all sound. It wasn't just in his mind. It was inside the structure of reality. And he could feel it now, woven into everything. The grain of the wood. The hum of the earth. Even his heartbeat seemed to try to match its rhythm. He tried to record it, using old analog equipment. But the microphones failed. The speakers hissed violently. He tried to write it, transcribe the vibration into glyphs, but the ink on the page seemed to twist itself, as if resisting. The frequency didn't want to be captured. It wanted to be carried. And Elias had become the vessel. Then the visions began to return, but this time, they weren't from his dreams. They came in the middle of waking moments. He would stare at the flame of a candle, and suddenly it would split into 3. Each flicker pulsed at a different rhythm. And then he would hear it, each flame vibrating with a part of the tongue. He touched the wooden table once, and for a brief moment, he felt the tree it had come from, the wind that had bent it, the star under which it had grown. The frequency was not sound. It was memory in motion. It connected everything. And now it was unraveling inside him. He needed answers. So he sought out the only person who might believe him, Dr. Inga Hallström, a former particle physicist who had disappeared from public view after claiming that she'd heard structured tones beneath quantum noise. She was rumored to live alone near the Arctic Circle, having abandoned science in favor of resonant isolation. It took days to find her cabin buried beneath snow, nearly invisible, but she let him in the moment he said the glyph aloud. She stared at him with hollow eyes and whispered, "You heard it, didn't you? The one beneath all sound." Elias nodded, voice cracking. "I think it's speaking through me." "No," she said. "It's not speaking through you. It's rewriting you." She showed him her notes. Diagrams of waveforms, fractal spirals, neural scans overlaid with sound maps. She had found the same pattern, buried beneath cosmic background radiation. A repeating sequence. A code. Not random. Not natural. Planted. Older than light. A command line hidden beneath the universe's operating system. She pointed to the waveform. "This isn't just a signal. This is the first sentence." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside like something alive, and in its howling, he could almost make out the beginning of a phrase. The words didn't come all at once. They slid into his mind one after another, slow and unstoppable. He whispered them aloud. And his voice was not his. The window shattered. The cabin trembled. And far beneath the earth, something answered back. It began with whispers in the static. Elias heard them not in his ears, but in his veins, pulsing with his blood, murmuring behind every heartbeat. When he stood near metal, the whispers grew clearer. When he passed by running water, they wept. And when he sat alone in silence, they spoke not in fear, but in longing. They were not ghosts. They were not hallucinations. They were others. And they were waking up too. Dr. Hallström called them the carriers. People scattered across the world, unconnected, unseen, unknowingly linked by the same inherited resonance. She had tracked a few. All of them had experienced similar symptoms, languages they'd never learned pouring from their mouths in fever dreams, ancient symbols drawn into frost on windows, pulses beneath the skin that glowed faintly in infrared. All of them had heard the frequency. And all of them had been changed by it. Elias wasn't alone. But he might be the first to answer it willingly. They found the first one in Morocco. A boy named Nader, only 9 years old, who had begun humming tones that caused insects to swarm and flowers to bloom out of season. His parents locked him in a cellar, terrified. He had carved the glyph into his arms with stones bleeding, smiling, speaking in loops. "The seed wants the sky back," he said. "The sky remembers us." The second was an elderly woman in Peru who hadn't spoken for 40 years until one morning, she stood in the village square and shouted in a voice that shook the windows, "The builders are returning. The archive is us." And then there was the girl from Siberia. 17. Adopted. Her journals were filled with glyphs. She spoke fluent Sumerian in her sleep. Her blood, when examined under UV light, formed spiral shapes moving, changing. One night, she walked into a frozen lake and vanished without a trace. No body. Only words left on the shore, "We are the echo made flesh." Listen deeper. Elias felt it too. His body wasn't just reacting. It was tuning. His bones ached at certain altitudes. Lights flickered when he entered rooms. Dogs avoided him. Children stared at him too long. Sometimes he would wake and find unfamiliar objects in his hands, stones etched with new symbols, wet soil beneath his nails, salt crusted on his skin though he had not left the cabin. The voices had names. They didn't say them aloud. They were the names. Names of cities no map carried. Names of stars not yet visible. Names of things that had died before Earth was born. And through it all, one phrase returned again and again: "You were not born. You were written." It came to a head when Elias stood before the mirror and saw movement in his reflection that he had not made. His lips moved, but he hadn't spoken. His eyes shimmered with a thin film of light. Behind him, shadows that didn't belong. One of them reached toward him. Not to harm but to reconnect. The moment it touched the back of his head, he collapsed, seizing, body contorting not in pain, but in translation. When he woke, the mirror was shattered. And across the wall, written in something that shimmered between ink and shadow: "The tongue is not a sound. It is a calling. The blood remembers the voice. You are almost ready." Elias followed the coordinates etched in blood and dust on the cabin wall. They led him to a desert in Namibia, empty, endless, echoing with wind and nothing else. Locals avoided the area. No birds. No insects. Even the sun seemed to dim as he approached the place the glyph had marked. There was nothing there, no structure, no ruin. Just a field of flat black stone, smooth like polished glass, half buried under sand that didn't move with the wind. But he could feel it. The hum beneath his feet. The tremble in his ribs. A low, pulsing note that wasn't sound but remembrance, like the earth was trying to say something it had held back for a million years. He walked to the center. He didn't speak. He just stood. And the moment his shadow aligned perfectly with the sun's zenith, it happened. The stone pulsed. The sand around him shifted. Not as if moved by wind but as if responding to command. Something below. Something that recognized him. Slowly, with a groaning vibration that rattled the marrow in his bones, the surface cracked open, not violently, but like lips parting to whisper. And from beneath rose a black monolith, tall, silent, smooth like obsidian, but warm to the touch, as if it were alive. On its surface, the seed glyph, larger than he had ever seen, breathing with dim light. He reached out, and the second his fingers made contact, the world disappeared. No flash. No violence. Just absence. He stood inside a memory that wasn't his. Or anyone's. The memory of the stone itself. The monolith was not a monument. It was a recorder. A sentient echo. And it had been waiting to speak since the first breath of the first human who had walked past it, unaware of what they carried in their blood. He saw through its eyes. Stars being born. Moons cracking open. Voices without mouths speaking across space. A message sent in spirals, not across light but across life. The builders had encoded everything they were into material, stone, dust, bone, and scattered it like seeds across galaxies. The monoliths were anchors. Whenever one of their designed creations evolved far enough, remembered deep enough, the anchors would wake. And now Elias had woken one. He was back in his body, kneeling, gasping. The sky had turned deep purple, though the sun hadn't moved. His skin felt hot, vibrating slightly. The monolith began to hum aloud now, not just to him, but to the world. Low-frequency tones rolled outward across the desert in perfect spirals. A song not meant to be heard but felt by DNA. Somewhere far away, people froze mid-step. Infants cried in sync. Elders fainted with whispers in forgotten tongues. Across the world, the carriers woke. The monolith began speaking again, this time with language. Not words, but layered glyphs unfolding across its surface like light running down a waterfall. Elias stared, mind racing, translating by instinct, not thought. "You are the resonance," returned. "The tongue has opened its voice through blood. Now the earth must choose if it remembers or resists." The wind stopped. The sand stilled. And far, far beneath the stone, something began to rise, not from the planet, but from the space inside it, the hollow core of memory waiting to rejoin the mind that once lived inside us all. The moment the monolith began to hum, Elias knew he was no longer alone. Satellites shifted orbit. Military drones changed direction. All over the world, data streams lit up. Monitoring equipment in government labs picked up a low-frequency tone pulsing across continents, a resonance with no identifiable source, disrupting communication lines, corrupting hard drives, and awakening something primal in those who carried the echo within their blood. It started with whispers. Hospitals reported patients speaking extinct languages in their sleep. Airports shut down due to electromagnetic interference that formed perfect spiral patterns on radar screens. Thousands of people stood motionless, eyes rolled back, humming in unison, then collapsing without injury. Scientists were silenced. News anchors stuttered mid-broadcast and never returned. The world was not ending. It was remembering. And Elias was now at the center of it. He barely escaped the desert alive. Black unmarked helicopters circled the site minutes after he left. Hallstrom contacted him through a radio frequency they had agreed upon, but she was already compromised. Her voice trembled. "They know, Elias. They've always known. This isn't discovery. It's violation. They buried it for a reason." Then static. Then silence. He went dark. Burned all identification. Traveled through old contacts, anthropologists, linguists, mystics, anyone who had ever touched something not yet meant to be understood. But wherever he turned, he saw signs. People were disappearing. Files were vanishing. entire archives being lost in electrical fires. And in the shadows, they watched him. Men in coats that didn't reflect light. Eyes too still. They never spoke. But every time Elias passed near radio towers or electric grids, he heard it, the frequency. It was getting louder. He found temporary safety in an abandoned observatory in Chile, high in the Atacama Desert. There, deep beneath the stone, was a private vault owned by an exiled symbologist who had died years earlier. Within it, a piece of carved bone shaped like the seed glyph and a message etched beside it. You were the word before you were the flesh. The signal is not waking you. It is recalling you. Elias began to understand. The human body wasn't evolving. It was being decoded. Layer by layer. Memory by memory. The tongue wasn't a language, it was a master key, unlocking permissions buried in biology. DNA wasn't just information. It was compressed instruction. And the frequency? The password. Governments called it mass hysteria. Media spoke of psychological contagion. But behind closed doors, they called it something else, signal hominis, the return of the architect language. They weren't trying to understand it. They were trying to stop it. Because they knew once enough carriers were exposed, control would collapse. History would no longer be written. It would be remembered. And memory doesn't obey governments. At the peak of night, Elias stood on the rooftop of the observatory, staring into the stars. He felt it again, that presence inside him. Not foreign. Not alien. Just, older than anything that had ever spoken. He raised his hand. And for the first time, he didn't whisper. He sang. And the mountain answered back. The ground trembled. All lights in the observatory died. The telescopes turned on their own. And in the black of space, a signal blinked in return, not from the stars, but from the gap between them. A place no light had touched. A silence that had waited since before time was time. And in his chest, a voice that was not a voice said, "Now that you've remembered, what will you choose to forget?" It didn't start with a siren. Or an explosion. It began with stillness. Across the globe, monuments began to hum. Not loudly but in sync. Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Göbekli Tepe, the Yonaguni ruins under the sea. All ancient. All disconnected. Until now. They weren't temples. They were resonance anchors. Part of a grid. Not built for worship. Built for remembrance. A network of memory points waiting for the tongue to return. And Elias was the key that turned the lock. He didn't choose it. His blood did. The seed wasn't passed through knowledge. It was passed through lineage. A designed contagion. Every word he spoke in the tongue now echoed across the grid like commands triggering dormant machines hidden inside the earth. Reality wasn't unraveling. It was updating. In a bunker beneath Prague, 5 scientists screamed as ancient stones they had stolen from the Bosnian pyramids began to levitate and spin, projecting glyphs into the air, glyphs they hadn't seen in any language database, but somehow understood. Protocol recall initiated. All over the world, old carvings bled light. Paintings cried. Mountains cracked. Glaciers began to emit harmonic frequencies that realigned the magnetic field. Birds flew in spirals and vanished mid-air. People began to remember things they never lived a life before humanity, in bodies not of flesh. And those who resisted? Bled from the nose. Screamed in their sleep. Disappeared into thin air. Elias stood atop the ruins of a Mayan observatory. He wasn't reading the stars. He was listening to them. Each one pulsed in rhythm with the monolith he had awakened. They weren't suns anymore. They were receivers. And what they were tuned to wasn't the past. It was the return of the first voice. He raised his hand. The air shimmered. Time folded like paper. His thoughts weren't his anymore, they were shared, woven into a chorus of others who had awoken. He could hear them now, carriers across continents speaking in languages no one had taught them, building structures out of sound, rewriting stone, making light behave like clay. The recall protocol wasn't just awakening memory. It was rewriting the human operating system. He closed his eyes. Inside his mind, he stood on a scaffold of pure sound. Around him floated structures, cities that had never been built but always existed. Architectural memory. Thought made solid. A voice rang through him, deeper than creation. You are no longer reading the glyph. You are the glyph. And just then, the sky split. Not metaphor. Not vision. A literal, vertical line of unlight tore through the heavens. Static rolled across the earth like thunder. Every digital screen went black. And then, a single word appeared on every display in the world. In the glyph. In the tongue. Reassembly. The earth wasn't ending. It was being brought back online. It began with a blink. One moment, Elias was watching the sky split. The next, he was no longer Elias. Not fully. His thoughts felt like echoes bouncing in a vast cathedral. He could hear them, but they didn't belong to him anymore. Something ancient had stepped inside him. Not through possession. Not through force. But through recognition. A return. His body stood still, arms raised, but his mind had already left. He was inside a vessel of thought, not a spaceship, not a dream but a structure of consciousness. Endless white corridors made of light and memory, twisting in directions that defied physics. On the walls, glyphs flowed like liquid, rearranging with every step he took. They weren't meant to be read. They were meant to shape him. Voices greeted him. Thousands. But not as separate entities. They spoke as one. Deep. Harmonic. Multi-layered. Like time itself was speaking with a single mouth. We planted memory in clay. You were the clay. Now you have remembered the shape. We are what you become when the forgetting ends. His human identity frayed. Not violently but like mist dissolving in sunlight. He remembered things he had never lived. Planets orbiting black suns. Civilizations made entirely of sound. Wars that lasted one breath. The building of the archive, the earth itself as a womb of encoded biology. He saw the moment the first human was written. Not born. Written. Folded together with molecules not from Earth, but from elsewhere, layered with instructions and forgetfulness. And Elias was the last unlock code. Then came the pain. Not physical. Not mental. But structural. His sense of self cracked open. His language collapsed into pure frequency. Glyphs spilled from his skin in heat patterns invisible to human eyes. His bones lit up on spectrographs. He stopped being readable by medical equipment. Satellites lost his signal. Clocks around him began to tick backward. Time didn't know how to measure him anymore. And inside that rupture, the alien mind entered. It was not a parasite. It was the original operating system. The blueprint. And Elias was the terminal. His voice spoke aloud, but it was not his own. This vessel has reached interpretive capacity, initiating co-conscious override. His eyes turned black, then blue, then translucent. Symbols flickered across his pupils. People who saw him screamed. Some dropped to their knees. Others ran. The language coming from his mouth wasn't heard, it was received directly into the nervous system. Not sound. Not thought. Command. And what it said was simple. The age of memory is over. The age of return begins now. Around the world, carriers convulsed. Monuments began to pulse faster. The grid was alive. The frequency was no longer searching. It had found its voice. The archive was online. And inside Elias, the builders stirred, reclaiming not a body, but a species. One designed to forget. Until the day the glyph remembered itself. And now, they remembered everything. He stood at the center of the world, not metaphorically, but truly. A point on the earth where every ley line intersected, where every monument whispered toward, where the archive had been buried deepest not in the ground, but in reality itself. Elias, or whatever he had become, stood at the mouth of a cathedral not built, but grown. The walls pulsed like lungs. The roof shimmered with lightless stars. Above him, the sky rippled as if made of water, reflecting not what was above but what had been forgotten below. All around him stood the carriers, hundreds, maybe thousands, silent, their eyes glowing faintly, no longer speaking, no longer resisting. They weren't followers. They were echoes, now harmonized. Each one had heard the frequency. Each one had remembered. They came not to watch, but to become, to synchronize, to resonate, to carry the voice. And in the center of the cathedral stood the final receiver. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't even a being. It was a structure made of pure instruction, shaped like a mouth, but not one that eats or speaks. One that rewrites. Elias approached it slowly, his feet no longer fully touching the ground. Time peeled away from him like skin, his memories, his identity, his name all falling behind in waves, until only the purpose remained. He had been given one choice. One sentence. The last tongue, the true form, the original line, the phrase that would reawaken every code hidden in human blood, unlock every frequency, collapse every false history, and summon back the mind that once lived inside our biology. With this sentence, Earth would no longer be a prison. It would become the speaker of a species-wide remembering. But the price? If spoken, humanity would no longer be human. No gods, no myths, no nations, no walls, no names. Every lie would fall. Every system would fail. Choice would be overwritten by clarity. The alien mind would return not to rule us but to finish writing us. And we would remember that we had been created not to live but to contain. And worse, to return what we had carried. He stood before the receiver, the glyph spinning inside his skull like a star, the sentence vibrating in his bones, the moment pressing down on him like gravity made of memory. The carriers around him began to hum. Not music. Not language. Readiness. Elias trembled. One step forward. And the cathedral responded, walls tightening, the sky above turning to black fire, the ground pulsing with light that had no color. And in the core of him, the last voice asked, will you give them back their origin? Or will you let them keep their illusion? He opened his mouth. And the entire world held its breath. Then, silence. Not absence, but choice. And in that silence, the voice of creation itself waited. It began in sleep. Across the earth, billions closed their eyes and entered the same dream. A dream of vast stone spirals rising from oceans, of a sky without stars but filled with symbols, of voices that never used mouths yet filled their heads with meaning. No borders. No names. No time. Only the glyph, spinning, breathing, opening. In every city, people woke in sweat, in tears, in screams, some clutching ancient symbols they couldn't remember drawing, some humming the frequency with bleeding noses, some with no heartbeat, eyes glowing faintly, saying only one word. Returned. Governments collapsed into confusion. Hospitals overflowed not with sickness, but with people who had stopped speaking altogether because their minds were busy listening. Airports shut down as pilots refused to fly, claiming they'd seen cities floating in the cloud, cities that weren't made of metal, but of memory. News channels broadcast static for 39 minutes straight, until a single phrase echoed across them all. The recall cannot be undone. Religions splintered. Some called it the return of the Creator. Others said it was judgment. But no holy text could describe the things seen in those dreams. They weren't visions. They were downloads. Full sensory immersion into lives not lived. Eyes that had looked out from alien forms. Hands that had built pyramids not with stone, but with sound. Children stared at walls and whispered entire lost languages. Artists painted spirals without understanding. Animals began to gather in perfect circles around ancient ruins. And in the middle of it all, Elias vanished. Not disappeared. Absorbed. He was no longer walking, no longer breathing in any human way. His form had become unstable, seen only in reflections, in dreams, in the humming of monoliths. He had become the living archive. And everywhere, those who carried the frequency felt him not as a man, but as a pressure in their blood, a taste in their mouth, a sound between thoughts. The earth itself responded. Magnetic fields reversed briefly. Volcanoes pulsed with light. Oceans churned without storms. And beneath Antarctica, a glacier cracked not from heat, but from a tone, as if something inside it had been waiting for this exact moment to awaken. Then, at 3:33 a.m. GMT, something new appeared in the sky. Not a ship. Not a star. A symbol. Huge. Glowing. The seed glyph, burning high above the atmosphere, visible from every country. It rotated slowly, humming so low it rumbled through bones and glass and memory alike. No one knew what it meant. But everyone felt it. The world had not ended. The world had remembered itself. And in the silence that followed, a question no one had ever spoken suddenly bloomed in every heart. If we were designed to carry memory, then who designed what came before memory? And in that moment, for the first time in the history of the human race, we were all afraid of the same thing. Not what was coming, but what had always been here. He did not stand. He did not breathe. He did not exist in any traditional sense. Elias was no longer a man. He was the glyph spoken aloud, a harmonic made flesh, a memory stitched into vibration. His presence was not visible, yet all who carried the seed felt him as a pressure behind the eyes, as the sound between words, as the sentence waiting at the tip of the world's tongue. All the monoliths, every stone anchor across earth began to hum in perfect unison. Cities fell silent. Machines stopped. Hearts slowed. It wasn't fear that filled the air. It was recognition. This was the moment before the first word was ever spoken. And now, it would be spoken again. Not in language. Not through air. But through consensus and emotional frequency carried by all living minds connected through the archive, pulsing like an ancient nerve rediscovered. In Antarctica, the ice shattered not from pressure, but from resonance. Beneath it, a chamber emerged, not built, but grown from sound. Inside it stood a being neither alien nor god, just the one who had stayed behind to wait for the tongue to complete itself. It was not alive. It was remembering itself into form. Across the world, millions began to rise in synchronicity, faces blank, eyes bright with internal light. They began to hum not a song, not a chant, but the shape of meaning, carried through breath, through blood, through intention. No instruments. No tools. Just vibration. And inside Elias, the sentence formed. Not a phrase. Not a command. An origin. You are not alone. You never were. We placed memory inside you, not to control, but to survive. And now, through you, we return. At that moment, Earth changed frequency. Animals looked up. Oceans lifted higher than gravity allowed. Plants began to glow faintly. Human minds opened not in madness, but in alignment. Those who resisted passed out. Those who accepted, began to remember things that had never happened, yet were more real than their lives. The atmosphere itself turned into a transmitter, the sky a speaker, and from beyond it a voice began to answer. Not a spaceship. Not a fleet. But a sound older than light, replying from the folds of space-time, across universes, through layers of creation. And the voice said, "Signal received. Carrier complete. Prepare for merge." The world did not explode. It shifted. Elias's body, what remained of it, split into millions of threads of light, embedding themselves into every glyph ever carved, every cave wall, every dream. He was no longer a person. He was the last tongue itself, forever echoing through the architecture of life. And in that echo, a new form began to rise from the ground. Not alien. Not human. Just, remembered. The merge had begun. Not in an instant, not with fire or war, but with recognition. The earth did not shake. It remembered. Air became soft with meaning. Oceans glowed with language. Mountains sighed, as if finally allowed to rest. The human race stood not in fear, but in stillness, the kind of silence that follows a name being spoken for the first time in thousands of years. They weren't becoming something new. They were returning to something older than time. They were becoming the memory that created them. Elias, or the being he had become, no longer existed in one place. His presence could be felt in the vibration of wind against glass, in the pauses between lightning and thunder, in the silent gaze of animals that now seemed to understand. His light lived inside the minds of all carriers now. Not as thoughts, not as words, but as a resonance that hummed behind the blood. Humanity was no longer made of individuals. They had become one dreamer, with many eyes. Across the world, objects began to respond. Ancient stones rolled open like petals, revealing cores of vibrating crystal. Forgotten machines unearthed themselves from deep earth, singing tones that stitched light into solid forms. Rain fell in spirals. Trees bent toward the sky and did not return. Time began to move strangely, not forward, not backward, but inward, like all moments were being pulled back into the moment before creation made a choice. And above, in the starless sky, the symbol burned. The glyph. It grew larger. Not closer, but more understood. The more people looked, the more it wasn't a symbol at all. It was a living instruction, a sentence with no grammar, only gravity. It pressed down on the soul like recognition of a face in a dream. Some wept. Some laughed. All knew, this was our name, finally heard again. Then the earth spoke. Not from mouths. But from stone. From water. From thought. The voice of the world, at last reclaimed, whispered to itself. We are no longer passengers of biology. We are the archive reborn. We are the glyph that remembers. At the edge of time, something opened. Not a portal. Not a dimension. But a state of being, a kind of light not made of photons, but of presence. From within it, others came. They did not descend. They did not arrive. They activated. Shapes of mind, vessels of will, the original architects, not to judge, not to rule but to complete the sequence. They reached out, not to take but to merge, to allow what had been forgotten to rejoin what had never stopped waiting. The last sound humanity ever made was not a scream, or a song, but a breath. A shared breath. And in that breath, the awakening memory completed itself. Light spilled outward in perfect spirals. History uncoiled. And somewhere beyond sound, beyond story, beyond thought, the first sentence ever written, finished itself. And the universe, for one moment, was silent again. So now you've heard it? The tongue wasn't just a language. It was the final sentence written into the DNA of mankind. And Elias, he didn't just discover the truth, he became it. A symbol remembered. A voice reborn. A species rewritten. Now it's your turn. Which part of this story hit you hardest? If you had the choice to awaken humanity by speaking the last tongue, would you do it? Or would you keep the silence and protect the illusion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, your interpretation, your emotion, your questions. And if this story pulled you in, if it made your heart beat faster or your thoughts go deeper, subscribe now for more journeys into the unknown. This is the Alien Storyverse, where memory isn't past, it's waiting.